The story of Alan Pace III begins with a man who appeared to have everything he needed to live a decent life, but instead chose a path that would lead him to orchestrate the largest cash heist in U.S. history. Born in 1965, Alan Pace grew up in a modest family with limited means. His upbringing was far from the extravagant lifestyle that would later come to define his criminal persona. Raised in a lower-income neighborhood, Pace faced the pressures that come with financial struggle, a constant reminder that money, how you acquire it and what you do with it, shapes your entire existence. Though little is publicly known about his early years, the impact of growing up in a working-class family likely shaped his perceptions of wealth and success. As the eldest son in the family, Pace would have witnessed firsthand the hardships his parents endured, which included financial instability. The desire to escape poverty and the restrictions it imposed on him became a driving force. Pace had always been an intelligent individual, but this intelligence was not nurtured in a way that led him down a traditional path toward academic or career success. Instead, he found a way to manipulate the circumstances around him in an attempt to fulfill his desires for wealth and freedom. It was this intense dissatisfaction with his socioeconomic standing that likely set him on the dangerous path to crime. By his early 30s, Alan Pace was working as a safety inspector at Dunbar Armored, a position that would inadvertently provide him with the knowledge necessary to plan one of the most sophisticated robberies the world had ever seen. Welcome to Unmasked, the channel you come to hear the shocking and the believable. Truth is darker than fiction, and we've got a long list of cases to prove it. Dunbar Armored, a company specializing in transporting, storing, and handling cash for various financial institutions, government agencies, and retail businesses, was considered a leader in the industry. With millions of dollars moving through its operation every day, the company's security was vital. It was within this highly secure environment that Pace would come to realize just how easy it could be to exploit the system. As a safety inspector, Pace was tasked with overseeing the company's security measures. He had the privilege of knowing the ins and outs of Dunbar's operations, the protocols, the guards, the security systems, and the vaults that stored unimaginable amounts of cash. His role granted him access to critical information that most employees would never come close to. The daily operations of Dunbar Armored were routine, predictable, and highly structured. Pace's job allowed him to move freely through the facility, monitor security protocols, and witness the vulnerabilities that even the most advanced security systems could not fully protect. While others might have seen their roles as just another job, for Pace, it was a treasure trove of opportunity waiting to be seized. But it wasn't just the knowledge of Dunbar's operations that fueled his ambition. It was his growing dissatisfaction with his life. By the time he took on his position at Dunbar, he was 32 years old, an age when many people reflect on their achievements and begin to take stock of what they've accomplished. For Pace, the feeling of having been left behind by his peers, of not having the financial freedom he so desperately craved, was palpable. His work at Dunbar, a company that handled vast sums of money, was a constant reminder of the wealth he didn't have. This deepened his frustration and ignited the spark that would eventually lead him to devise an unthinkable plan. The heist didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision made in the heat of a moment. No, Alan Pace spent months, possibly even years, observing the routines and systems of Dunbar Armored. As a safety inspector, he was in the perfect position to meticulously study the security protocols in place and the areas where they might be vulnerable. Every day he walked the halls, assessing how guards patrolled the area, where cameras were placed, how often money was moved, and the exact locations of vaults and safes. He knew when shifts changed, when security was at its weakest, and when the building would be at its most vulnerable. But what truly made Pace's plan so remarkable was the amount of detail he put into it. He not only observed the physical layout of the building but also built an intricate understanding of the company's procedures. This wasn't a hasty robbery orchestrated by an opportunistic thief. It was a carefully planned, methodical heist that was years in the making. Pace didn't work alone. He reached out to several associates, criminal figures with whom he had previous connections. Among them were Eugene Lamar Hill, who would later become a key figure in the investigation, and others who would be integral to the execution of the heist. Pace carefully selected his team, ensuring each person had the skills and the temperament to pull off a job of this magnitude. He didn't want reckless individuals. He wanted people who could follow a plan to the letter without hesitation or mistake. The team was given detailed instructions about the layout of the facility, including the best routes to take to avoid surveillance cameras. Each member of the crew was entrusted with a specific role. Someone would be tasked with loading the money into the truck, others would serve as lookouts, while some were responsible for handling the logistics of the getaway. Every move had been anticipated, every obstacle accounted for. But even with such a thorough plan, there was a critical element of risk. The Dunbar Armored Facility was not just any warehouse. It was a high-security facility that transported millions of dollars daily. The stakes were enormous, but Pace was driven by a single, powerful desire: to escape the financial constraints that had defined his life for so long. He was determined that nothing, not even the inherent risks of the heist, would stop him from achieving his goal. The morning of September 12, 1997, was like any other at the Dunbar Armored Facility in Los Angeles, but for Alan Pace III and his carefully chosen team, it was the culmination of years of meticulous planning. The target was clear: $18.9 million in cash. Money that was to be moved, counted, and stored by one of the most trusted companies in the world. For Pace, it was an opportunity to finally break free from his financial struggles. The execution of the heist was a cold, calculated process, a crime so sophisticated that it would come to be known as the largest cash robbery in U.S. history. The operation began with what seemed like an ordinary morning at the Dunbar Armored Facility. But for Pace and his team, it was anything but ordinary. The day before the heist, Pace and his accomplices had already infiltrated the facility, taking care to ensure that the plan was seamless and that no mistakes would be made. The team had spent days preparing the necessary tools: a rented U-Haul truck, disguises, and equipment designed to bypass security measures. Each member of the crew knew their specific role, and the timing was critical. The heist was meticulously timed. At 2:30 a.m., the crew arrived at the facility, where Pace had been working as a safety inspector for years. They parked the U-Haul truck at the back of the building, where the money would be transferred. By then, Pace had already gained an intimate understanding of the facility's layout and security measures. He knew that the guards typically changed shifts around 3 a.m., providing a window of vulnerability. As the crew donned their disguises, steel-toed boots, uniforms resembling security personnel, they blended in, looking like just another group of workers on a late-night shift. Pace's team was composed of several key individuals, each handpicked for their skills and ability to remain calm under pressure. Eugene Lamar Hill, one of the main accomplices, played a crucial role in managing the logistics of the operation. Hill, who had a criminal history, had been recruited for his ability to handle high-stakes situations. Other members of the crew were tasked with the actual loading of the money, while some took on the responsibility of securing the area and ensuring no one raised suspicion. Each member had been thoroughly trained and briefed on the plan, ensuring they could carry out their duties without hesitation. With the guards' routine in mind, the team knew they had a limited amount of time to carry out the robbery. Once the first guard shift change occurred, they would have a small window to act. By the time 3:15 a.m. rolled around, they were ready to begin. The plan was simple: infiltrate, load, and escape with the money without leaving a trace. The crew had to bypass several layers of security: access codes, alarms, cameras, and vaults. Pace's familiarity with the inner workings of the facility gave him an enormous advantage. He knew exactly which security measures were easy to disable and where the blind spots in the facility's camera system existed. In a matter of minutes, the team disabled the security alarms and cameras, making their move toward the vault. The U-Haul truck, positioned in the rear, had enough space to hold the stacked cash. The money was neatly packaged and ready to be transferred into the truck, and the crew wasted no time in loading the bags. The truck was driven in carefully, its arrival timed precisely with the turnover of the guard shifts. The crew moved quickly, working in tandem to load the money into the vehicle with a level of precision that mirrored the planning that had gone into the job. Within 30 minutes, the task was completed. The $18.9 million in cash was secured, and the team, without leaving a single fingerprint or trace, drove off into the night. Despite the thorough planning, there were unforeseen challenges that came with executing such a high-risk crime. The Dunbar armored facility, while vulnerable, was still a secure building with multiple layers of protection. While the team's ability to bypass security was impressive, there were moments of tension. As they began loading the money into the U-Haul truck, one of the guards briefly entered the area, leading to a momentary panic. However, the quick-thinking team member managed to divert attention by pretending to be part of a routine maintenance operation, buying enough time to continue loading the truck without being detected. The pressure mounted as the team realized they only had a small window before the next shift would arrive, and the chance of a full-scale security breach increased. But Pace remained calm and focused, communicating with his team to maintain control. The most remarkable part of the heist was the team's ability to work with such efficiency under extreme pressure. In total, they had 30 minutes to steal nearly $19 million in cash, and they succeeded without anyone raising suspicion until it was too late. However, this was not a flawless crime. One of the more significant challenges occurred with the U-Haul truck. The team had anticipated that their escape would be seamless, but as they prepared to leave, the truck experienced a mechanical issue, one that could have delayed the operation. In a split-second decision, the crew member driving the truck handled the problem without panic, getting the vehicle back in motion. The heist continued uninterrupted, a testament to the team's training and preparation. Even the smallest hiccup could have led to catastrophic results, but the group managed to evade disaster. In the hours following the robbery, the heist appeared to be an untraceable crime. For Pace and his associates, the feeling of success was almost immediate. They had managed to steal a staggering $18.9 million without a hitch, and for the moment, no one suspected foul play. The Dunbar facility remained unaware that the robbery had taken place, as the perpetrators had left no discernible evidence behind. Pace's team divided the money, with each accomplice receiving their share. The funds were moved to various locations, where they would be laundered and spent in ways that would make tracing the origin of the money exceedingly difficult. The crew's efforts to cover their tracks were sophisticated. Bank accounts were created, properties were purchased, and connections with shady figures were leveraged to further distance themselves from the crime. But while the team celebrated their success, they were not prepared for what came next. The money had been moved, and at first, it seemed as though no one would be able to track it. However, a crucial mistake, one that would lead to the unraveling of the heist, was made, but it would take time for authorities to realize the scale of what had occurred. As the days went by, Pace and his crew believed they had pulled off the perfect crime. They were temporarily free from the law's reach, with no suspicion hanging over them. Yet, unbeknownst to them, the downfall of their elaborate plan was already beginning to take shape, and the fate of the missing $18.9 million would eventually become the focus of an intense investigation that would eventually expose the masterminds behind the largest cash robbery in U.S. history. After months of meticulous planning and an almost flawless execution, Alan Pace and his crew believed they had pulled off the perfect crime. They had stolen $18.9 million from the Dunbar armored facility without a single trace left behind. It seemed as though they had outsmarted the system, slipping through the cracks in one of the most secure operations in the country. But one critical mistake, made by one of Pace's accomplices, would bring their perfect crime crashing down. The mistake came from Eugene Lamar Hill, one of the main figures involved in the heist. Hill, who had a criminal history of his own, had been carefully chosen by Pace to be part of the crew because of his experience in handling high-risk situations. But in the aftermath of the robbery, Hill made an error that would change the course of the investigation. After the money was stolen, the crew worked quickly to launder their haul, spreading the cash through various channels to make it untraceable. The problem arose when Hill used a portion of the stolen currency that still had the original straps from Dunbar Armored, straps that were uniquely marked with identifying information. The bills, still wrapped in the original straps used by Dunbar Armored to organize and transport the cash, were now traceable. This seemingly small detail would eventually become the crack in the perfect plan. The wrapped currency was a direct link back to the robbery. The markings on the straps, typically used to identify bundles of cash for the company's internal processes, would stand out if anyone took a closer look. And that's exactly what happened. Hill, either unaware of the risk or simply not thinking through the consequences, used these straps in a real estate transaction, unwittingly leaving a trail that would soon lead investigators straight to the stolen money. It wasn't long before the authorities would catch wind of this mistake, setting the stage for the unraveling of the entire operation. The break in the case came when a real estate broker, who had been involved in a transaction with Hill, noticed something strange. Hill had been attempting to use the wrapped currency to make a large down payment on a property, but the broker, having handled large amounts of money in the past, noticed the peculiar straps. The broker recognized them as belonging to Dunbar Armored, a company known for its role in transporting and storing vast sums of cash. Immediately suspicious, the broker decided to do what few others might have done. They reported the incident to the authorities. This tip-off was the breakthrough the investigation needed. With the real estate broker's information in hand, law enforcement began to look deeper into Hill's financial activities. They traced the money back to the robbery and connected it directly to the $18.9 million that had been stolen from Dunbar Armored. The distinctive straps had made it clear that the money in question was not just any currency. It was part of the stolen cash. What followed was a painstaking investigation to piece together the full picture of the robbery. Investigators connected the dots between Hill's use of the wrapped currency and the employees at Dunbar Armored, quickly discovering that the robbery had been an inside job. Surveillance footage, interviews, and forensic accounting led them to Pace and the rest of his team. The evidence was mounting, and the authorities now had a clear direction to follow. In the days that followed, investigators worked tirelessly, analyzing the methods and movements of the crew, gathering evidence that pointed back to Alan Pace as the mastermind behind the heist. Surveillance tapes from the Dunbar facility, combined with the testimony from the broker and the forensic tracking of the money, began to expose the web of deceit that Pace had carefully woven. It was only a matter of time before the authorities would close in on the crew. The moment law enforcement caught wind of the tip-off from the real estate broker, a full-scale investigation began. At first, the authorities didn't know who was responsible, but they knew that the money had been traced back to Dunbar Armored. The FBI, along with local law enforcement, formed a task force to investigate the robbery. The scale of the crime, the amount of money involved, and the fact that it had been an inside job meant that this case would require an all-hands-on-deck approach. The FBI's involvement was critical, as they had the resources and experience to handle such a large-scale investigation. Local police in Los Angeles also played an integral role, sifting through evidence and following leads. Investigators quickly turned their attention to the money trail, focusing on anyone who had been in contact with Hill or other members of the crew. Key investigators from both the FBI and local police force used a combination of techniques to piece together the timeline of the robbery. Surveillance footage was obtained from Dunbar Armored, which showed the suspicious activity around the time of the robbery. The investigators also worked with forensic accountants to trace the stolen money. Their methods weren't just limited to paper trails. They also employed wiretaps and informants to get closer to the suspects. As they dug deeper, they found a number of connections between Hill and the people he had been in contact with before and after the robbery. The investigation began to narrow down a list of possible suspects. Each lead pointed toward Alan Pace, whose inside knowledge of Dunbar Armored made him a prime suspect. The authorities learned that Pace had been working at the company as a safety inspector, giving him unprecedented access to the facility and the money being moved through it. The breakthrough came when investigators realized that several members of the robbery crew had been in regular communication with Pace. Surveillance footage, bank records, and informants started filling in the gaps. Investigators tracked down known associates of Pace and began to connect the dots. What they had once thought was an unsolvable case was quickly becoming clear. The investigation now had a concrete direction, and it was closing in on Pace and his team. With the investigation building steam, law enforcement was now poised to make a critical move: the arrest of Alan Pace. On the morning of November 14, 1997, agents surrounded Pace's home in Southern California. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to make an arrest, and they did so without hesitation. Surveillance, Wiretaps and extensive background checks had allowed investigators to track Pace's movements and communications, building a case that left no room for doubt about his involvement in the heist. The arrest of Alan Pace was a significant moment in the investigation, but the real story lay in how law enforcement had pieced together the case. Pace, who had once believed he had outsmarted the system, now found himself facing the consequences of his crime. His reaction was one of shock and disbelief. For months, he had carefully avoided detection, laying low and hoping that the investigation would stall. But now, with agents at his door, the reality of the situation became undeniable. Pace was arrested and taken into custody, charged with masterminding the largest cash robbery in U.S. history. In the wake of Pace's arrest, the investigation continued to zero in on his accomplices. Law enforcement had already connected Eugene Lamar Hill to the crime, but it was clear that there were other individuals involved. Pace hadn't acted alone, and investigators were determined to track down each member of the crew. Some of the accomplices, facing the mounting pressure of the investigation and their own potential arrests, decided to cooperate with law enforcement. Their cooperation would prove invaluable, as it led investigators to the full extent of the operation. These individuals revealed critical details about the planning and execution of the robbery, providing insights into how Pace had orchestrated the heist. One of the key players, Hill, became an informant after his own arrest. Facing the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, Hill agreed to provide information on Pace and the other members of the crew in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony was crucial in securing the conviction of Alan Pace and bringing justice to the case. Hill's cooperation revealed how Pace had carefully organized the robbery, selecting the crew members who would carry out the job and providing them with the necessary instructions and tools to succeed. The investigation also uncovered how Pace had kept a tight grip on the operation, ensuring that each member of the crew played a specific role in executing the heist. The level of detail and precision in Pace's planning became clear, and it was only with the cooperation of his accomplices that law enforcement was able to fully understand the scope of the operation. As the investigation unfolded, the legal consequences for everyone involved became inevitable. Pace was charged with masterminding the robbery and faced a lengthy prison sentence. The other members of the crew were arrested and charged as well, with some facing lesser sentences due to their cooperation with law enforcement. When the dust settled and the law enforcement machinery had churned its way through the evidence, the reality of Alan Pace's crime had become undeniable. The magnitude of the Dunbar robbery, with its $18.9 million in stolen cash, was about to move from the streets and news headlines into the courtroom, where the legal consequences would unfold with dramatic force. The trial of Alan Pace III would become a spectacle that captivated the public, all the while reflecting the high price of greed and betrayal. The legal process began with the formal charges brought against Alan Pace and his team. Pace, the mastermind behind the heist, was charged with conspiracy, armed robbery, and theft of interstate shipments. His role as the inside man, combined with the evidence that linked him directly to the crime, made his case a high-profile one. The evidence presented against Pace was substantial. Surveillance footage from the Dunbar armored facility, testimonies from his accomplices, and forensic evidence from the crime scene. The prosecution had a robust case, with everything pointing back to Pace as the orchestrator of the largest cash robbery in U.S. history. The prosecution's strategy was simple: demonstrate how Pace's intimate knowledge of Dunbar's security systems allowed him to plan and execute the heist with military precision. They brought in witnesses who testified about the planning stages, the logistics of the heist, and how Pace used his position as a safety inspector to navigate the facility undetected. The evidence presented was damning. Pace's involvement in recruiting the crew, selecting the tools for the robbery, and ensuring everything was set in motion was all laid out clearly for the jury. The prosecution used this to build a narrative of deliberate, calculated crime, emphasizing how the robbery had been years in the making and how Pace's greed drove him to take extreme measures to escape financial hardship. The defense, however, was determined to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Pace's legal team argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial, attempting to suggest that there were other potential suspects with access to the same security measures at Dunbar Armored. They suggested that Pace's position as a safety inspector could have been exploited by others within the company, and they argued that his involvement might not have been as direct as the prosecution portrayed. While this strategy may have seemed plausible at first glance, the overwhelming weight of the evidence and the cooperation of the accomplices made it difficult for the defense to mount a strong case. Their attempts to undermine the prosecution's narrative ultimately fell flat. As the trial began, the media descended on the case with the kind of fervor that often accompanies high-stakes crime stories. The Dunbar robbery had captivated the nation from the very moment the heist was discovered. And now, as Alan Pace stood trial, the public couldn't look away. News outlets covered every twist and turn of the case, with daily updates on the proceedings. The sheer scale of the robbery, the sophistication of the plan, and the drama surrounding the arrest and trial all contributed to the media frenzy. For a time, it seemed as though the case was the talk of the country, dominating television broadcasts and newspaper headlines. The media's portrayal of the trial was a blend of fascination and sensationalism. Coverage painted Pace not only as a criminal mastermind but as a symbol of greed and corruption. Documentaries, news specials, and investigative reports sprung up, eager to delve deeper into the psychology of a man who had seemingly chosen a life of crime in the pursuit of wealth. But amid the sensationalism, the ethical implications of how the crime was covered loomed large. Media outlets profited from the public's fascination with Pace's story, but this came at a cost, sensationalizing the tragedy of those affected by the robbery, particularly the employees and families of Dunbar Armored, who were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered security and sense of safety. The verdict came after weeks of testimony and mounting evidence. On November 13, 1998, Alan Pace was found guilty of orchestrating the heist that had shaken the country. The jury had deliberated carefully, but the evidence left little room for doubt. Pace's sentence was swift, and the consequences of his actions were soon laid bare. He was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison for his role in the robbery. The sentencing was a moment of profound emotional toll for both Pace and his family. Pace, once a man who had enjoyed the fleeting luxury of his crime, now faced the reality of spending decades in prison. His family, who had once stood by him, was left grappling with the shame and loss that came with his conviction. The consequences of Pace's crime extended beyond the courtroom and reverberated through the lives of those closest to him. The consequences of Alan Pace's actions extended far beyond the courtroom. After his conviction, Pace was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Safford, Arizona, where he would spend the next 24 years of his life. The psychological toll of serving such a long sentence was immense. For someone who had once been driven by ambition and the desire for financial freedom, the harsh reality of life behind bars was a stark contrast. The dreams of wealth and success that had motivated him to pull off the heist were now distant memories. In prison, Pace had plenty of time to reflect on his choices. He learned firsthand the cost of greed and the destructive power of crime. The mystery of the missing $18.9 million loomed large throughout the investigation and trial. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, only a fraction of the stolen money was recovered. The rest of it had been laundered, spent, or hidden by the accomplices, who had done everything in their power to ensure that the stolen funds could never be traced. Some of the money was never found, and the fate of those millions remains a topic of speculation. Ultimately, the Dunbar robbery serves as a reminder of the high price of trying to escape financial hardship through illegal means. Pace's story is one of a man who lost everything in his pursuit of wealth, only to end up paying the ultimate price for his greed. His legacy, marked by crime and its consequences, serves as a powerful cautionary tale for anyone who might think that a shortcut to success is worth the cost. Don't just be a viewer, become a witness. Subscribe and tap the bell, because around here, every episode uncovers something you won't see coming.